Hey guys, what's up? Steve here. It's getting pretty darn close to Halloween, and I want to ask you guys a question. Considering the pandemic's going on, and obviously, I'm not going to be going around anybody, but how do you guys like the mask? I got it supporting a local business, and I thought it was pretty cool and Halloween themed. Yorick seems to like it. Nobody's going to get that reference, are they? You know, if I wore my to be or not to be programming shirt, it would be a lot better. But anyway, since there's nobody around, I'm going to go ahead and not wear the mask. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about horror movies, especially fitting considering we're around Halloween. And I told you guys in my last video that I want to make videos where I kind of just talk randomly about things related to film. And what better way to start than to start with one of my favorite genres ever. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved horror movies. I grew up watching horror movies. When I was a very little kid, I wasn't watching a lot of horror movies because they scared me. But as I got just a little bit older, I started to increase my film repertoire. I'd say the first scary movie that I actually remember watching, even though you could debate whether or not this one's really scary, because in a way it's kind of making fun of slasher movies, is the movie Scream. I was, I think, 5 years old when this movie came out, and I remember my older sister really loved this movie when it was coming out, and she, probably against the wishes of my parents, sorry guys, showed me this movie. And when I was a little kid, I was kind of scared of it, but at the same time, I really liked it. And I honestly liked the movie. And I think it was one of the things that added the fuel to the fire of me liking horror movies. And I think it was the exact same year when I saw The Craft for the first time. I know, me being a guy, my first exposure to horror films was Scream and The Craft. Both of which, oddly enough, starred Neve Campbell and also Skeet Ulrich. Yes, there was an actor whose first name in his Screen Actors Guild name was Skeet. That probably wouldn't fly today. And I also remember that when I was a little kid, my older sister also had a friend who looked a lot like one of the characters in The Craft. And basically, when I was a little kid, remember, I was like 5 years old, so I barely know the difference between movie and reality. I actually thought that that friend was that girl from The Craft, so whenever she came over, I got pretty damn scared. Because basically, I thought that my sister's friend was a teenage witch and that she was gonna get me. But that's basically where my love of horror films started. As I got older, there was this wonderful thing called the Sci-Fi Channel. Now, the Sci-Fi Channel is very different now from when I was a little kid. And actually, I don't even know if it's still a channel anymore. Sorry, I didn't look that up before making this video. I'm gonna look really dumb saying this. But anyway, the most recent version of the Sci-Fi Channel that I know of is very, very different from what it used to be like when I was a little kid. Sure, they had some original content, but when I was a little kid, they showed a lot of older horror movies. And by older, I mean like ones from the horror movie heyday, like late 70s, early 80s, and some very obscure ones from the very early 90s. There's one that is extraordinarily cheesy and not scary at all, but when I was a kid, I loved it because I liked that cheesy stuff when I was a kid. Barely anybody remembers it because it was a direct-to-video movie, but there was this movie called The Cellar. It was about this little kid who goes to spend some time with his dad in Texas, I believe it was, somewhere where there's just a bunch of desert and low-budget goodness, and there's a monster in the cellar, and that's pretty much it. And I also remember the first movie that actually really, really scared me when I first saw it as a kid, and I'm talking about like once I actually started actively seeking out horror movies. I'm not somebody who scares easily, and even when I was a little kid, I didn't get scared super easily. But there were two movies actually that scared the shit out of me when I first saw them. One of them was the Amityville Horror, which honestly I look at it today and I don't understand why the hell it scared me, because that movie, it's not that good. But one that also scared the shit out of me because it really felt like it could actually happen, and I was a little kid at the time, remember this, was Cujo. That movie scared the shit out of me. You know, the one with the St. Bernard that gets rabies and ends up trapping this mom and her son inside of their car. I love horror movies. I grew up watching them, and I still love them to this day. But I also kind of hate horror movies. I have a really weird love-hate relationship with horror movies. And in this video, I'd like to kind of explain where that comes about, and what I appreciate about horror, and what I don't appreciate to what's happened to it. Horror is like a subcategory of the drama category, and even within the horror category, it's so general that you can do pretty much anything you want with it. You can make something that's a slasher. You could make something that is something that just gets under your skin. You could have a haunted house movie. You could have a movie with a bunch of jump scares, which usually I don't like very much. I'll get to that in a bit. Or you could get something that gets down to something totally primal, something that hits you in that soft spot that you've had since you were a child that really gets to you. Horror is one of those genres that you can do so much with, and there are so many different reactions you can try to get that are so visceral from the viewer. One way you could approach horror is the fun route, and it can be a really good time. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why I ended up liking it when I was a kid, because I tended to like the more fun ones. The very best description I can actually give to it is actually from a movie that I didn't see until I was in my early 20s. And this movie is not a horror movie, but it's called Matinee. And it basically follows this filmmaker, or rather it doesn't follow the filmmaker, but there's this character who is a filmmaker, played excellently by John Goodman, I might add. His character specializes in making creature features. The movies that he makes are definitely just fun, scare people kinds of things. And most people who hate horror movies think, why the hell would you actually pay and watch something that is going to scare you? Well, honestly, one of the speeches that he gives in the film is something that describes that, I think, really well.
I remember the one time we moved. Now, this was to the big town, Hatfield, Missouri. I was petrified of those guys.
Really?
Oh, yeah. But see, now I get my revenge. I get to scare everybody else, but it's for their own good. See, people who go like this at the scary parts, they're not getting the whole benefit. You got to keep your eyes open.
What's the benefit?
Okay, like a zillion years ago, a guy's living in a cave. He goes out one day, bam, he gets chased by a mammoth. Now he's scared to death, but he gets away. And when it's all over with, he feels great.
Well, yeah, because he's still living.
Yeah, but he knows he is, and he feels it. So he goes home, back to the cave. First thing he does a drawing of the mammoth. And he thinks, people are coming to see this. Let's make it good. Let's make the teeth real long and the eyes real mean. Boom. The first monster movie. That's probably why I still do it. Make the teeth as big as you want, then you kill it off. Everything's okay. The lights come up. You see, the people come into your cave with a 200-year-old carpet. The guy tears your ticket in half. It's too late to turn back now. Water fountain's all booby-trapped and ready. The stuff laid out on the candy counter. Then you come over here to where it's dark. There could be anything in there. And you say, here I am. What have you got for me?
And obviously horror is a spectrum, like I said. On the totally opposite side of the spectrum is another part that can be very hit or miss. And that is the part that gets at something primal, and the part that tries to go to something deep. One example of a movie that I can think of that does this really, really well is the movie Hereditary. Hereditary is an example of a masterfully made film, and a masterfully told story that I absolutely love, but at the same time, I can't say that I enjoy watching it. Hereditary is a deep, mature study of a family being torn apart, in some ways by psychological means, and in some ways by supernatural means. But there's something deeply grounded about it that makes it feel totally real. to a certain extent. I mean, there are certainly things that happen in the movie that are, totally supernatural and totally unrealistic. But there's something so grounded about the movie that feels so real. And it gets to that deep primal level. And it's one of the most emotionally draining horror films that I've ever seen. And that's what I mean when I say that horror is so varied. You can have something that's totally just a thrill ride and a good time. And you can have something that still falls into that genre and still is classified as horror that really is meant to be horror. Something that's totally meant to be emotionally distressing, but still well worth watching, and still holds this place where you could say, this is an example of how to do this right. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the more fun, thrill ride types of movies are a way to do it wrong. There are tons of movies that do it perfectly. And then there are movies that have a subtext of social commentary underneath them. One that I can think of off the top of my head that is one of my favorite movies of all time to this day is Night of the Living Dead, the original 1968 film by George A. Romero. And a lot of people think, why the hell would that be one of your favorites? It's super low budget. But there are a couple of reasons. One of them is that it's one of the first mainstream zombie movies, and they accomplished so much on that minuscule budget. But not only that, but there are some social commentary undertones with the movie. For example, how the main character, his fate at the end of the movie, and also taking into account that it was the first mainstream horror film to have a black main character. At the time, this was totally groundbreaking. And honestly, if you haven't seen the movie, I don't want to spoil it, but the ending is definitely one that points to some historical context that I'm not going to forget anytime soon. The horror genre is just so widely varied that there's so much you can do with it. You can use it as a fun thrill ride. You can use it to tell a very, very depressing and deep story. And you can use it as a morality play. And then there's the part that I really don't like about horror, which isn't necessarily about horror itself, but it's the part that makes it a bit more dangerous to play with. One of the common threads that we see in horror movies is that they can be made very cheaply. And honestly, you can make any movie pretty cheaply nowadays, but horror is extremely easy to make cheaply. And I'm not talking about how, I have an iPhone that I'm shooting this video on right now and I'm making it ridiculously on the cheap. I'm talking a major Hollywood studio could spend just a couple $1,000,000 making a movie and still make bank. And yes, to you and me, a couple $1,000,000 is a totally unobtainable sum of money. But to a Hollywood studio, that's chump change. That's something that they could easily throw out the door and not really have a care in the world. But horror is a genre that brings people in. People still go out in droves to see horror movies. I mean, maybe not nowadays, with the pandemic. But horror is one of those genres that just draws people in. And I think a lot of it is for the reasons that I mentioned about why I love the horror genre. But studios take advantage of that. And people who want to make a quick buck with spending very little money to do it take advantage of that. So here's an example of somebody who actually took advantage of it in a good way, because I don't consider these films bad. If you look at George A. Romero and Night of the Living Dead, he spent very little money to make that, and sure, he kind of got screwed over by the people who, were distributing it, and that kind of sucks. But that movie raked in a ton of money. And then, back in the 90s, you had the Blair Witch Project, which was, at the time, the most profitable movie ever made, because they made it for a budget of, I want to say it was roughly like $65,000. And to most filmmakers, that's not a lot of money. And while it was not the very first found footage film, I will probably make a video in the future about how I argue that the Blair Witch Project was not the found footage film that came first. There are actually a couple of precursors to that, but it was one of the first notable found footage films. And a lot of it had to do with how it was advertised. That movie came out, and they basically advertised it as if these people in this movie, they were real people and they actually disappeared, even though we know that they were actors. But because of that expectation and because that drew people in, and because of the way it was presented as if it was this real documentary and these people actually disappeared and here's what happened to them, that movie ended up making millions upon millions of dollars and became, up to that point in time, the most profitable movie ever made. And then, back in the 2010s, I think, came Paranormal Activity. Now, you can say what you want about the sequels. I don't like them very much. I actually thought that the first Paranormal Activity film was pretty good. And regardless, you have to respect what the guy who made it did. So that movie was made for, I think, $15,000, which was even way, way less than what the Blair Witch Project was made for. And they didn't even have a distributor at the time. Basically, this guy made this movie and made an online campaign showing bits of the movie and people reacting to the movie and saying, hey, you want to see this movie? Sign this thing here and make your local theaters actually distribute it and show it to people. And strangely, that worked. It was pretty much the first time anything like that had ever happened for a film. And it ended up becoming the most profitable movie ever made. Now, the thing is, studios know that you can make a horror film very cheaply, and regardless of how good it actually is, it can rake in a ton of money. There's this particular formula that happens with Hollywood movies today that are horror films. There are certain characters who get lost, there are certain characters who are just stereotypes, and those characters end up going through a series of jump scares, and most of those jump scares are false. And what I mean by that is a false jump scare I refer to as a jump scare where you're just scared because a loud sound just played and it's not the thing that you're supposed to be afraid of, like a cat jumping out of a closet, or somebody, this is the worst one in my opinion, somebody putting their hand on somebody's shoulder out of frame and then a loud sound plays. Now, jump scares have their place, and sometimes even false ones do. But when it is the mainstay of your movie, and it's the one thing that is making your movie intense, usually that means your movie's not going to be very intense. And that's what I mean. There are so many movies that have this very manufactured type of formula to them. A group of teenagers end up investigating something or get lost or whatever the hell happens, and they're usually stock characters you can't really give a shit about. And there are a bunch of false scares, and something ends up coming after them. And then there's this giant showdown with that something, and basically because you ended up wasting all of this fake tension leading up to it, it's not scary once you get to that third act. But basically because people still go to see those movies in droves, the studios make money because they were able to make these movies very, very cheaply. Even if people didn't like the movie as soon as they saw it, it could be one of those cases where the movie made back its budget in its opening weekend. And basically because of that, technically it didn't fail. And the studio is going to look at that and be like, hey, sequel. Nobody's asking for it, but sequel. And that's the part I don't like about the horror genre. I think that it's a double-edged sword. It's very, very tough to take those things that are advantageous about making horror films, that you can make them cheaply, that you can make them for a pretty small amount of money, and that pretty much anyone, if they really wanted to, could make just a horror film. But it takes a certain level of skill to do it right. And I think that when it comes to a lot of the horror movies we see today, and I'm not saying this about all of them because there are tons of great ones, a lot of movies that we see hitting theaters today or coming to VOD today that are horror films, are not made by people who actually care about the material and are putting skill into their craft. It's people who just care about the dollar signs. It's people who know that they can just put something out there and make a ton of money back. And, you know, the same could be said about the movies that are fun. Sure, you could make something that is stupid and brain dead fun, but you've got to have that passion behind it, and you've got to have that feeling of a good time behind it. But there's something about a lot of horror movies made today that does not have that fun factor to it. It feels manufactured, and it feels a lot like there's just the dollar sign quotient there. I do want to say that I still have a love-hate relationship with the horror genre, and I have a love-hate relationship with horror movies. With that being said, I think that the ones that I love vastly outnumber the ones that I hate. And regardless of what studios do, and regardless of the trend that we see in horror movie cash cows being made just to rake in a buck and not having any merit to them whatsoever, I still think that we see a lot of movies made today that are worth something, that are worth the watch, that do give you something worth watching. And I think that is a reason why, even though I have that love-hate relationship with movies, there's more on the love side. And there is that part of me that does not like hating on movies that even I don't like that much. Because, as I've said in many of my previous videos, when I was in my teenage years, I made a really terrible horror movie. It wasn't feature length, it was roughly 20 minutes long, but I look back on it now and I see it as a terrible movie. But I worked super hard on it. And because of that, I have enough humility to say that I know that it's ridiculously hard to even make a shitty film. Some people do put all their heart and soul into something and they don't get the product that they like. They don't get that thing that they wanted to make. And you know what? That's okay. Because nobody makes the Mona Lisa on their first try. They make the stick figure drawing that they put on the fridge. To me, that movie that I made when I was 15 was the stick figure drawing that ended up going on the fridge. And will I ever make a Mona Lisa? I don't know. Probably not. But I don't think that we should use that as an excuse to encourage all of the other people who want to make the Mona Lisa. If there's a movie you want to make it. And if it doesn't turn out the way you want to make it, don't be discouraged. And you know what? If you want to make that practice movie where you don't see it as the biggest project ever, but you see it as just a good time and a way to gain experience, do it. Make it. Because every time you have somebody make a movie, you're going to get a bunch of really bad ones. You're going to get a lot of okay ones. But you're also going to get those diamonds in the rough. And those diamonds in the rough are well worth finding. And enough rambling for tonight. I'm hoping you guys at least kind of enjoyed this video. No, I'm just kidding. I really hope you did enjoy these ramblings. Honestly, I do want to keep making videos like this, not necessarily talking about this kind of stuff, and probably maybe a little bit more polished in the future, and maybe with a bit more of an itinerary. But, you know, I want to talk about film, and I like talking about film. And if anybody wants to listen, feel free. If you like what you see in this video, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps people find the channel who want to see content like this. And if you haven't already, if you're new here, if you've seen some of my videos but just haven't yet, or if you really just want to see more content from me, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. And if you really want to be notified when I make a new video, instead of just randomly finding one because you're a subscriber, go ahead and hit that bell icon so that you can actually be notified when I make a new video. That is it for today, guys. I hope you're staying healthy and safe, and if I don't see you before then, which hopefully I'll have a video about before then, but if you happen to stumble upon this one right beforehand, have a happy Halloween, and I'll see you guys later.